Welcome to Licensed Poetics, a podcast about creative storytelling. I'm your host, Fang Ling. And today we have an extremely exciting guest in the studio. Joe, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. I will introduce Joe after a personal message that I'm going to tell the audience. So today is a very special episode because this is the first episode I'm recording after the departure of Ahim, the co-founder of this podcast. So first of all, I'd like to wish Ahim the best of luck on his future projects. And secondly, I'd like to thank all the listeners for supporting this podcast. Now, I don't usually get personal in these episodes. I think the listeners will have noticed that, partly because I want the listeners to know me as a reader, my reading preferences and my reading interests, my literary interests, but not so much about my personal life or feelings. But because this is a special episode, I just want to say how much this podcast means to me. I have watched the book community on YouTube and on Book Talk for ages, and I've always wanted to be a part of that reader community. But I really dislike being on camera. So if you follow LP on Instagram, you'll have noticed that I never really show my face. And because so much of online content these days rely on people showing their faces, so I've always felt that maybe I'm excluded from that conversation. But then I was inspired by a wonderful podcast called Books Unbound by the amazing Ariel Bissett and Raylene LeMay. And they show me that it is possible to just use your voice through podcasting to create good book content. I'm reminded of a quote by Daphne du Maurier, who is one of my favorite writers, that writers should be read, not seen. I felt really validated by that. I do feel I have a lot to offer using just my voice and my words, not my face. So it is May of 2024 now, and for the rest of this year, LP is going to be my main focus, and I will work hard and make it the best podcast it can be. And finally, most excitingly, I have launched a Buy Me a Coffee for Licensed Poetics. If you don't know, Buy Me a Coffee is a really easy to use platform where you can support LP by making a one-off donation or by becoming a member. So if you'd like to support this community and support me, please consider buying me a coffee, or in my case, buying me a chai latte. Okay, so that's it for my message, and now I'm going to introduce the wonderful guest today, Joe. Joseph Hathaway-Wilson is a writer and journalist from Sydney. He currently works as a reporter at ABC News, before which he was involved in student journalism and community radio. His short stories and essays have been recognized in a number of local publications and awards. He is regularly involved in local arts and writing projects with councils and grassroots initiatives. Thank you so much for being here, Joe.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk to you about the grassroots initiatives and projects, and also about your journalism work. So I'm keen for this chat with you.
Perfect.
Okay, so let's just get straight into our reading updates. I promised the readers last episode that I would talk about this book, so here I am delivering on what I promised. And that book is none other than In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado. It is quite a well-known book. I'm sure many of our listeners will have heard of it. So it was published in 2019, and it is a book about an abusive lesbian relationship. And it has been called a part of the queer canon already for a book that's so recently published. So it's quite a big achievement, and it's fairly well known. And I actually read it for my wonderful book club. Shout out to Vivian, Adiba, Rachel, and Kate. Shout out to you guys, and I love our book club. The themes are abusive relationships, obviously, and that's actually a topic that I'm really interested in, particularly the mind control or identity control aspects of abusive relationships. So the first thing about this book is that it's marketed as a memoir, which I just think is completely inaccurate.
Really?
Really. I don't think it should have been marketed as memoir at all. I think it should just be nonfiction, because I'm not a big memoir reader. I honestly can't remember the last time I read a memoir, but I think calling it a memoir sets a certain set of expectations for the reader, which this book does not meet. So, are you a big memoir reader?
No, I'm not huge on memoirs. I've read one or two, but no, not many.
I feel like when you call a book a memoir, you kind of expect to know what happened in the writer's life, right? Like you want to know exactly what happened. This thing led to that, and this thing led to that, and then they made this decision or whatever.
Yeah.
But I feel like this book has a really significant emphasis on like delving into the topic of queerness outside of the author's immediate personal experience.
Right, so is it almost a bit essayistic?
Exactly, essayistic. There's a lot of critical reflection, which actually is the part that I enjoy the most. But I've heard complaints of people saying, I expected to know what happened and how she felt, and then instead I was getting all this other stuff that I wasn't expecting. So I think, maybe it should have been called nonfiction instead.
Right, I'm really interested to read that book personally, because I haven't read it, but I have read her short story collection, Her Body and Other Parties, and I think it touches on themes, or not so much themes, but things like that, abusive relationships, societal expectations, femininity, and that sort of thing. But as those who have read Her Body and Other Parties will know, it's all told through this really, really dark fantasy horror lens.
Oh, is it? Really?
Yeah, none of it is like super, you never have a completely reliable narrator throughout, which we love in a story. But it's fascinating watching her weave the morals and the ideas and the feelings into the actions of those characters, right? So when I heard that she was writing a memoir, I was fascinated as to how she might do it, because you do, as you've been saying, think of memoirs as these almost objective recounts for the most part. But she does very much have that dreamy style of writing and that somewhat unreliable narrative voice.
That's right, dreamy style, I think. Yeah. It comes through even in this nonfiction work.
It doesn't surprise me much to hear that she has presented this memoir, or not memoir, as we're saying, in a way that does make you think twice about everything that she's saying.
Yeah, 100%. I'm surprised to know that Her Body and Other Parties has like fantastical themes, because it's a short story collection, right?
Yes. The themes sort of very, very grounded in reality. Things about body dysmorphia and abuse and that sort of thing. But yeah, the vessels with which he tells those stories are, monsters or ghosts and ghouls, or dystopias and that sort of thing, which is especially jarring, but incredibly, incredibly impactful, especially as, a straight white man who hasn't really felt or, experienced a lot of the things that she is talking about. I think it was, really deeply moving, incredibly visceral, I would say.
Yeah, there is definitely that imaginative element in the dream house as well. I was going to say that this book has very short chapters, which I love as a reader. It makes reading it so much easier. But some of those short chapters would be sort of standalone imaginative scenes. I remember there's one particular chapter where the abusive woman is a queen squid of something, right. With like lots of tentacles to grab in potential.
That sounds fitting for Machado, yeah.
Right? So that chapter left a pretty good impression on me. I still remember it.
But do you think that sense of discomfort that you acquire from expecting it to be a memoir and expecting it to have these objective elements is deliberate? The way that you jump into it and it sort of subverts your expectations. Do you think she's done that quite deliberately, or is she expecting her readers to have read, her prior work? She is one of those authors that has a bit of a cult following going on.
Yeah, she does. Hey.
So I'm wondering if you're talking about like the slight discomfort, I think is the word, that you felt when you went into it, not so much because of the subject matter, but just because of what you're expecting it being a memoir. And do you reckon she's playing on that sort of removal from the conventions of the memoir genre?
I'm not a big memoir reader, like I've mentioned, so I didn't have that set of rigid expectation like that some people are complaining about. Instead, when I read all that critical reflection and context, I was just pleasantly surprised.
Yeah.
So maybe, do you think honestly, I don't know if it was her choice to call it a memoir or a marketing decision, really. Because don't you think if you say it's a memoir about an abusive relationship, it'll sell better in like a really messed up way?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to think not, but probably yes.
Oh, the other thing that I really loved about this book is the second person narration technique that she used. Yeah. Normally, I don't really love second person. So it's when the writer goes, you did this, you did that, this happened to you, instead of I did that, this happened to me. I feel like it can be used as a way to put distance between the action and the self. And sometimes it doesn't work, but in this book, it really does. So she does this genius thing where in those short chapters, right, some chapters will be written from the currently abused woman's perspective. So that abused or battered woman mindset, those chapters will be delivered in second person. So she slams the door on you, you cry in the shower kind of thing.
Yeah, right. Which I can very much see how that could be utilized. When you think about, what we know about trauma and the psychology of trauma or being traumatized, we use terms like depersonalization and derealization, which is very much almost like you're watching your life unfold before you. It's the way that we describe that feeling of being completely detached and helpless.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that sounds like it would be painfully like accurate.
Yeah.
The experience of trauma.
Exactly. I think that's right. Depersonalization, that's the word. That's a great word.
Yeah.
It definitely creates this effect, and it has this like almost discomforting effect of distance of like that pain is so real, but then in order to save yourself, almost like you're distancing yourself from it, both in the moment and also in the writing of it.
Yeah.
But then outside of those chapters, we have the normal first person chapters. So that would be the author either from prior her abusive relationship or afterwards, when she is able to look back and form a critical reflection. So those chapters are delivered in first person. That's I did this, I thought that, and then these two are like interspersed within each other. So it's not like a clear timeline. Whereas, but I felt that choice made it a lot more approachable for the reader in a way. Like you're not overwhelmed by one perspective or the other.
Yeah, which is interesting because utilizing those perspectives and transitioning between the first person perspective and the second person perspective is, I'd imagine, it's meant to capture that feeling of being completely overwhelmed by the trauma of her experience. So even though it makes it much more accessible for the reader, right? I can only assume I haven't read the book, but it does go towards capturing that feeling of the being so confronted by your surroundings and your experiences that you just completely remove yourself.
Yeah, I think it definitely does. It's a almost three-dimensional approach to this whole thing, which was very effective. I really admire that. So this book definitely has a pretty high level of craft. I can tell.
Yeah.
And then I won't spoil things, but I will say that this disparate perspectives, the second person and the first person, it was resolved in a very clever and subtle way towards the end of the book. I really loved that bit, but in the book club that I was discussing this book with, some of them completely missed that.
Right.
I was so heartbroken when I heard that. I was like, wow, that's such a subtle moment. As a writer, there's a lesson to be learned from that, because like you can't always expect the reader to be completely generous with you. And then like if there is a good idea, you want to execute it. And then like it's good to be subtle, but sometimes not so subtle.
Yeah, I understand that.
The other thing is that if I was to critique this book in some way, I felt like I wanted more. And especially what I talked about earlier with the mind control bit, almost 1984-esque, where when you're trapped in that mindset, like how it shapes your mind and how you're just convinced that you're responsible for the abuse that you receive. And then you make up elaborate excuses for your abuser. There was a little bit of this in the book, which I enjoyed, but I just wish there were more of it. It's a really short book as well. I think I would have liked it to be like 1.5 times longer, to be honest. There was one bit that's interesting where she said, because she was trying to write the whole time during this relationship, and she said everything she wrote was fragmentary.
Mm-hmm.
And then because she's struggling to form a coherent thought and then to let those thoughts kind of take her closer to the truth because she's scared to see the truth. So everything she wrote was fragmentary.
Yeah.
So that was an interesting effect on the mind that I thought was really interesting.
This whole book sounds like it'd be a fascinating study of, the relationship between the writer and their characters, essentially. Especially given, the protagonist of the novel, or not the novel, the memoir is her. I guess when you look at how literature has just traveled over the past century or so, we have, I think, since the early 1900s been moving towards reader immersion, right? Like that's the road.
Reader emotion?
Immersion. Like reader immersing
immersion.
the reader
right,
in the, in the experiences of the characters or the concepts explored. And I think that's a trend that we've just been doing throughout the arts, just in general, from, serial novels that were printed in newspapers all the way to video games where you're literally controlling the characters, right? And I think Machado is like a proper stepping stone in that she is using a quote-unquote old world medium in writing, print, but she's really vamping it up in a much more modern context, in the way that she might take a genre like this, like memoir, which, as we established, we have a clear set of expectations for, in the sense that, he said, she said kind of thing. It's a recount. And she has narrativized it, but not only narrativized it, but really played with what the reader can and cannot rely on. In the sense that she's also playing with the first person, the second person, and as you were saying, like the thought control elements, which, even though not true to what we know of the conventions of memoir, is perhaps a lot more accurate of what her actual experience was in that situation of being in an abusive relationship.
Yeah, I think this book is definitely formally experimental.
Yes.
Which I think I like when it works. And in this book, it definitely works.
Good. I'm glad. I've got to read it.
The other reading update, I guess, is kind of huge and kind of hilarious. I'm going to start reading Crime and Punishment.
Oh, yeah.
And it's a huge announcement because it's a massive book. I think it's known for being one of the big books.
Yeah,
right?
one of those books you just so many people start and they never get around to finishing.
One of those books, like War and Peace and stuff. Yeah. Which I think I will tackle at some point in my life. You know the big books like Moby Dick as well?
Yeah.
It's one of those. But the story is I found this really gorgeous new edition at Dimmicks in Melbourne, actually. And it was only $17. And I was like, $17 for a cute paperback? It's a new translation by Oliver Reddy. I just had to pick it up. And I was like, I might as well just start reading it now. And instead of letting it just rot on my bookshelf and not picking it up for ages and ages.
Good move. Because otherwise it will rot. You know that if you put it there, it's just not going to get picked up.
Oh, no. So yeah, I'm going to start reading it. I'm very excited. Just the few pages of the introduction that I've read so far is already so fascinating. I will continue to keep LP updated on my progress in Crime and Punishment.
Yeah, Crime and Punishment. I've never read Dostoevsky, but it's like one of those sort of old, canon of literature sort of books that I'm scared that I wouldn't be reading it because I'm fascinated by what I'm reading. I'd be reading it so that I can say I read Crime and Punishment, which is completely like immature of me. But being honest with myself, it's like if you were to read Ulysses,
Oh my God.
anything else in that Hoover. Like, I'm reading it so that I can say that I've read it. I'm absolutely not going to get anything out of it. Which is probably a question for my own self-reflection rather than for the listeners of LP. But
no, to be honest, like a good part of it is I want to say I have read Crime and Punishment. But I think I'm confident that I will get a lot out of it because I have read a fair bit of Russian literature in my life, and I find most of it to be very rewarding. So,
cool.
I don't know if I can say the same for Ulysses though.
Yeah, I didn't get very far through. I won't lie.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
you tried?
Yeah, no comment on Ulysses. It was just. I hope that someday in my later life I can sit down at a podcast and talk about it really analytically and give some profound new insight. But yeah, I got very little from that experience.
My lovely friend Michelle, shout out to Michelle, actually gifted me a copy of Ulysses for my birthday. So I'm kind of obligated to at least try it. But like, it's funny because I was just saying I like formally experimental stuff, but like, how much experiment can I really take?
Yeah. It's a test. I'll say that much. It is a test.
This reminds me of of last year. I tried to read Catch-22.
Oh yeah.
And I didn't get very far either because it was just too nonsensical for me. Have you tried it?
No, I haven't.
Joseph Heller. I thought I was going to love it because people compare it to American Psycho and Slaughterhouse-Five. Both books I loved, but I can't get into Catch-22.
Yeah, it's a balancing act when you're working with experimental literature. It's like pushing the boundaries and, grasping something that wouldn't otherwise be there if you told the story in a more conventional way,
That's
whilst
right, yeah.
also just not losing the reader's interest. Which is why so much of it is like impossible to read. If you think about like the canon of literature and things that you may have had to study in high school, so much of it. I'm thinking specifically of that play, Waiting for Godot.
Waiting for Godot. How do you pronounce that? Godot?
Godot. Yeah.
Godot.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
I get why it's important, but it doesn't mean it's interesting, Can
you remind me what's it by again? I've heard of it, but I don't remember.
Waiting for Godot by Samuel Beckett. So Beckett was
Beckett,
like Joyce's understudy, which makes sense if you're familiar with Ulysses and you're familiar with Waiting for Godot. But one of those things that's quite firmly rooted in context, and if you understand the context, you'll understand why those conventions were perhaps interesting or were groundbreaking, but they don't make them fun to read or watch, I can imagine.
That's a pain.
So it makes me, I'm curious to see how Machado's work will age, because I think she does also play with those, as you've been saying, experimental conventions. But I love it, I love it when she's doing it. I don't so much love it when I'm reading it like in Joyce or Beckett.
I think Machado will age well.
I hope so.
Yeah, she is experimental, but her work is still accessible. I think. That's why it's so popular,
I guess it will just become a matter of how well did it respond to, the milieu of now and what people are thinking and feeling about today, 2019 or 2024. Like Waiting for Godot, right? It's made to be inaccessible. It's made to be boring.
Okay.
But because it reacted so well to what people were thinking and feeling in post-World War II Europe and America, I guess, it's, I don't want to say it's aged well, but it's aged memorably. We have a reason for coming back to it the same way we do with Dostoevsky and Joyce, etc.
Yeah. It might not be good, but it's memorable.
Yes, yeah. So, yeah, I'm fascinated by how Machado's work will age from here on out.
Yeah, that's right. But yeah, I'm really keen to read Crime and Punishment. Please follow LP on Spotify if you don't want to miss my updates. Now let's jump into the conversation with our guest, Joe. So firstly, I would love to talk about the Grassroots art initiatives. So I know that you are part of Debaser Events.
Debaser? Yeah, that's the one.
I would love to hear you talk about it. I went to one of Joe's poetry events the other day and it was fascinating. LP is technically a grassroots art initiative.
Hell yeah.
Right?
Absolutely
Yes.
it is.
Part of a community. Woohoo. But yeah, how do you find running and also being a part of these initiatives?
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's I guess you could call it a passion project in the sense, like it is a passion project by the definition of that term, but also the more that you put into it, the more you get out of it. But you've got to be searching for things to put into it. Did that make sense?
You got to be certain?
You've got to be, you got to be consistent and you've got to really pour your heart and soul into it if you want it to work out. And occasionally you'll come across these various events where you can see people haven't quite done that. They've done it for a profit incentive, which can be good depending on how well resourced they are. But usually the work on display speaks for itself. To give the listeners a bit of background, so Debaser Events is a grassroots events company. They mainly work with live music, also put on some local art, and occasionally I'll jump in and help out and organize a live poetry reading for them. They're based around Chippendale, which is just across from Ultimo at the mouth of the city, I guess. But it's one of many sort of local events groups that are starting up in and around the inner west in Sydney. I know there's a whole heap more if you go out to Western Sydney. But yeah, it's fascinating because I think for a while in Sydney, and this intersects with a whole lot of other conversations going on about how alive or how dead the Sydney live music scene is or the live art scene is. But you get the sense that there's this whole upcoming generation of Sydney-siders who are pretty, despairing about how alive or dead the Sydney live music scene is. So they've started doing it themselves. They have seen the ramifications of the lockout laws, and they've probably spent the first few years of adulthood in COVID lockdowns. And so now they just sort of, pick up their tools and they're working away at starting up something new.
That's fantastic to see.
Yeah, it's really cool. There's a lot of local venues I've noticed who are also really open to having these events occurring for free.
That's so good.
I mean, they're usually bars, so as long as people are going to the bar, they don't mind too much. But yeah, a lot of them have been particularly generous with their time and with their space. But I think what's been most rewarding for me working in these poetry nights for Debaser is just seeing that creative community form and return as well. Night after night, people will come back and they'll note who their favorite poets were, and they'll check in with each other and they'll follow each other. And that, I think, is an invaluable experience. I'm sure you would know as well that when you are an up-and-coming writer, I don't want to say up-and-coming as if we've got something destined for us, but when you are an aspiring writer, let's say that, when you're an aspiring writer, it is easy to feel absolutely and totally isolated in your craft, either because, you're not sure how good you are, you don't have people to reflect your work off, you don't have people to talk to about it, you don't have people to tell you that your writing's not so great when it's not so great, or great when it is great. You completely lose all sense of
community.
Yeah, community and also progress. Not to say that progress is the ultimate goal all the time, but it helps. It helps to, keep you going.
Definitely, yeah. You can physically see something growing.
Absolutely, yeah. And so what I love about these Debaser poetry nights isn't so much seeing a huge crowd turn out, although that's really nice and that's really rewarding when that happens.
The room was full when I was there.
Yeah,
it was excellent.
And that's nice. And that's nice. But it's seeing, these kids, freshly 18-year-old kids, get up.
A lot of uni students, I noticed.
Yeah, a huge proportion of uni students get up and share work. A lot of it for the first time. A lot of people who I know don't pride themselves in their writing because they're designers or they're in marketing or in business or law students or whatever. Or they're just not studying at all. And they're getting up there and sharing what they've written for the first time because it shows that everyone can write.
Yeah.
Of course, not all of it's going to be good, but it doesn't have to be. That's not the idea. The point is you've got writing and you've got an audience, and that is all you need. So it has been an exercise in reframing essentially where the value in writing lies.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah, and that's been really nice and rewarding. But also the most rewarding part, is seeing people hone their craft and seeing people acquire that sense of community, which I think is happening more and more with every event.
Absolutely. I definitely think so.
And Debaser is not the only one. Hijinks Alley is another events company, which I know is, I don't think they do as much poetry stuff, but they have done it recently. They're mainly live music focused from what I've seen. But that's the nice thing about all of these up-and-coming events companies. There it is again, up-and-coming. But that's the nice thing about these young events companies is that they are open to anything. They're not established. They don't have a whole lot to lose, a lot of them. So they'll do whatever works, right? And they'll do whatever's fun. They'll do whatever people are happy to come along
means,
to.
Right?
Yes, absolutely. So sometimes it's not so much the quality of the art on display or the music on display. It's just the fact that you can walk into a room on top of a pub and see there's artworks there and there's bands playing and there's people reading out poetry and they're all your age and they've all got your qualifications. That's the bit that you live for. And that's why I think a lot of the beauty and grassroots arts initiatives is. That's why I could do them forever. Couldn't because they don't pay, but they're an amazing way to spend your spare days.
I love what you said. Like the value of it, just being there is value enough, honestly. And then making a thing happen, that's just so rewarding. And I feel like I love it when you compare it with the experience of being a writer, because like being a writer is like so much struggle and that you put in so much work with so little presentable result.
Yes.
But then when you're taking part of these more community focused events, like you can make a thing real. You can make it happen. And then I guess that's exactly what I'm trying to do, really, with my writing. Of course, I can have a word count, but it's hard to gauge that and hard to share. But then with LP, I can make it into like a real thing that exists. And there's like a lot of accomplishment, like there's a lot of pride in that as well, as I'm sure you feel every time when you see these beautiful faces show up at the poetry nights.
Yeah, absolutely. And I should also note that it's an incremental thing, and there are a lot of other initiatives that have come before on which we're laying our foundations. So I don't know where Debaser started from. I didn't start it, but this poetry element of it, which I think I'm the only person who's been commissioned to put them on, I think. There are so many different poetry events going on in and around Sydney, which have been beautiful to watch. They have been beautiful to be a part of. Revolution Renegade is one of the ones that comes back time and again. I remember going to one of their events in and around Darling Harbour about 2 years ago, and it wasn't super professional, right? Like so many of the people there, they didn't know each other. They had just jotted their name down on a piece of paper moments before, and they got up, but the pieces that they had to share were so incredibly moving, and so you could see the healing occur in that space. Like they had written down what they were saying in the days or in the weeks or the months before, but so much of the art form was being there in that room, reciting those words and having people react to it, having people hear it. That's what made it special, was that reader-listener relationship. On another note, which is going off on a huge tangent here, but it makes you reconsider the purpose of poetry and writing more broadly.
That's not a tangent. That's exactly what we're talking about.
Yeah, this is true. But in the sense that the most powerful poetry is always spoken, I personally think.
I think it should be read out loud.
Yeah, absolutely. And the beauty of the poetry is not in the way in which those words have been constructed. It's in the way that someone else heard them and they resonated with them.
That's right,
and so that's what I found. That back and forth, that opportunity for reflection is something that, even though we have proper live music concerts and we have larger, professional poetry readings when you get touring poets come internationally, that's something that I think is a lot more discordant in big professional environments. It's something that happens best in these grassroots environments. Bankstown Poetry Slam, obviously everyone's heard of. That's like the benchmark, because when you're in that space, it sometimes feels professional because of how good that quality of work is, but it's very subtle. It's low key. It's like arms are open there. Anyone can get up and read.
It's very community.
Absolutely, and that's what makes it special.
Yeah,
they
keep saying. Yeah, they're right. They say at every event that this is a volunteer-run organization.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you just get the feeling that it wouldn't be so special if it wasn't that.
Yeah, if it was like a huge corporatized poetry kind
exactly,
of thing,
yes.
it would be different. Yeah,
100%. And that's the sort of thing that we're aspiring towards. And the amazing thing is that that's a feeling, right? You don't hit a certain benchmark. It's not like, once we've sold X number of tickets, you acquire this certain feeling in the room. You could have 5 people sitting there in the room and one person reading poetry, and you would still get that resonance and that magic that is reading live poetry and resonating with live poetry.
Yeah.
But yeah, I found it incredibly rewarding in many ways, which I didn't know were possible.
Do you ever perform? Because when I went that time, you didn't know.
Hell no.
Okay, now that's very funny. I love how you're so passionate about organizing this community, and yet you're reluctant to perform your own work.
I find it rewarding. To be honest, I don't rate myself as a poet particularly. Like I can do some things quite well. Poetry is not one of them. Which I know counteracts a bit of what I've just said. But I think for me, the most rewarding part has just been being there. It's an honor to be there every time.
Creating the thing.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, so if you don't write poetry, what are the main forms that you write in? Essay?
Well, for the past couple of months, it's really just been journalism. I've been really lucky to score a cadetship at the ABC newsroom in Sydney. And that's been my job. That's been my life pretty much. And it's a completely different world to everything that I've been doing before.
I can imagine. I can't wait to hear about it.
Yeah. Like I've been involved in student journalism before. I was very lucky to edit UTS Vertigo.
Oh, Vertigo. Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
If you ever pass by UTS, go in and grab a free copy. I think it's free.
Yeah.
Oh,
absolutely.
fantastic. Love it.
And so that was a real developmental experience for me, being able to edit that.
Were you like the editor of a particular section or the entire thing?
So in the first year that I did it in 2022, I was just a general editor. In the second year, I was the editor-in-chief, which was, it was tiring, but it was rewarding.
Really? Okay.
Just seeing the sheer diversity of work there and being able to have those one-on-one working relationships with writers and being able to pick their brains and being able to help them on that road to expressing themselves. That was amazing. But it's vastly, vastly different to the sort of journalism that I'm doing now, which is a lot of just sort of straight copy. What's the crux of the story? If you can say it using less words, you should say using less words. There's a lot of lessons to be learnt from news writing, but it's I'm not going to pretend that that you have to do one to get to the other. They are completely different art forms in terms of short story writing or essay writing and
different forms.
News journalism.
Yeah, I've read your name on ABC actually.
Oh no, how embarrassing!
No, there are news articles that are very informative and do the job.
Yeah, but there's no mistake about it. They are worlds apart.
Okay.
But yeah, so that's what I've been doing recently. Outside of that, I love a good essay. I've been trying to perfect my essay writing. Because I think, and I was saying this to a friend the other day who's also studying creative writing or creative writing equivalent at the University of Sydney, is that so much of the best fiction is essentially non-fiction that's been narrativized, or non-fiction, and we just put in these characters as proxies for our own thoughts and feelings, or for people who
absolutely, that is what fiction is.
Absolutely. So I think honing the craft of essay writing or honing the craft of non-fiction is, in a way, one of the best things you can do for fiction writing.
Absolutely, I completely agree.
Yes, without limiting, the scope of your imagination, or, obviously if you're writing fantasy or science fiction, it's a completely different ballpark. Although not all the time.
No, I don't think so. I think whatever fiction you write, even if it's set in some alien planet, you have to have that intellectual core argument that's supporting it.
Yeah,
and then and then if you're just trying to write down those thoughts, that would be nonfiction. So I think all fiction can be distilled down to nonfiction if the author wanted to, I think.
Yeah. Well, and so that's been my aim recently. How successful I've been in doing that, I'm not sure.
What are some of the themes that you've been writing about?
Oh, you put me on the spot now. I'm fascinated by taking a really innately human feature like memory or a particular emotion like longing, and just seeing how that's been warped in our current environment. So everyone since the dawn of time, since Shakespeare and before, has been able to write about the feeling of reminiscing or the feeling of nostalgia, but they haven't been able to write about the feeling of reminiscing and nostalgia in a 21st century environment when so many of our photos and so many of our memories, or the means we have of recording our memories, are completely artificial, right? I think that's fascinating. And I'm not just talking about AI. I'm talking about before AI. I'm talking about just social media, in which we love to document. But that's something I think has been defining characteristic of the past of society in the past 30 years.
Hey, that's a great idea. I'm already very interested.
Yeah, so it's ideas like that, but it's also tricky. That's such a broad topic, and it's so psychological and so academic that it's really difficult to boil down into an essay. So that's been the bane of my existence recently. It's just taking one of these insanely universal topics, universal experiences, and boiling them down into a bite-sized essay.
Oh my God. Hey, I love that. It's like, what does nostalgia or reminiscence or memory even mean in this age where time can seemingly be so easily captured, right?
Yes,
in photo form or video form.
Or also when you're staging those memories, like when you look at social media, and this has been said time and time before, but when you look at social media, that's not how the memory was.
Yeah, it's curated, yeah.
But it also begs the question of what is closer to, our actual memory of an event, or what is closer to not so much our memory of an event, but how an event actually unfolded. Is it nowadays where people are swayed by aesthetics of capturing a moment? You might prefer taking a photo in which everyone's looking in a different direction, or people are just, casual. What's the word that people use?
I think I know which one. The opposite of staged, right?
Yes. Yeah. Oh no, this is going to destroy me now.
Candid.
Yes. do you want a candid photo or do you want, a stage photo, right? And we laugh at that now, right? Because it's like, oh, that's so ridiculous. Like, quick, guys, look candid. But
that's the opposite of what candid means. That's funny. Yeah.
Yeah. But in looking candid, are you going to get a more accurate representation of what happened and what unfolded than, say, in 1970s or the 1980s, where you said, everyone smile for the photo? Because that's the opposite of candid. Also the opposite of candid. But it's perhaps even further away from what actually unfolded than telling people to look candid.
Yeah, it's that act of construction is so deliberate and so immediate. Yeah, that's very fascinating.
The tricky thing is that, I know I can write, and I know I have the skills to write essays, but boiling down those ideas, as I mentioned, but also just being able to examine them and articulate them in a way that is
interesting.
Interesting, but also just good enough, I guess, for want of a better word. These are academic fields. Like, everything that we're discussing right now is something that could be discussed in a university context by people
in a PhD thesis.
Yeah, exactly. And that's someone's job. It's not my job, and I'm in no way qualified to do that. So I think it's a challenge that we face as creative writing becomes more of a craft or a vocation in and of itself.
Yeah. Wow, I love that. And I love that comparison with what we're doing versus a scholar, right? Because I think about this a lot because I always, for some reason, need a lot of research for my fiction. And then sometimes I'm like, should I have a sociology degree to be able to qualify for this? But then I try to tell myself that the reason that what I'm trying to do is different to what those scholars or academics are doing is because I'm adding my personal experience or interpretation or emotion into this thing. And maybe that's what gives creatives the license to do what they're doing. I mean, I think creatives absolutely should read the work of academics, but then I think what creators are aiming for are a little bit different to what the academics are aiming for. I think
so. And it saddens me that we're in a time when it feels like you have to do one or the other, as opposed to back in the day where you have, Chinua Achebe, who's,
Chinua Achebe, the Nigerian writer?
Yeah. He was like esteemed professor at university, but also wrote one of the most, seminal works of the 20th century, right? I had both.
Things Fall Apart.
Yes.
Yeah. I haven't read that. I need to read it. Wow. Yeah, being a professor definitely doesn't hurt to be a good writer.
But it feels like so many of the writers and the authors that we know now, they have doctorates and such, but the doctorates are in creative writing.
Yeah.
Or Umberto Eco, he's another good example.
I haven't heard of them.
Yeah, so Umberto Eco is a professor or doctor of semiology at, I think, the University of Bologna in Italy. And he wrote two particularly famous works, and they've just both escaped me. One of them is Foucault's Pendulum. And I can't remember what the other one is. We'll circle back to that. And I think his works have been regarded so highly. It's like quintessential highbrow fiction that you get told to read when you're studying English. Because he was able to integrate so many of those deeply, profoundly academic concepts.
I think, wow, that's such an interesting point, to be an academic in a certain field versus to be a professor in creative writing.
Yeah. The Name of the Rose, that's it. The Name of the Rose and Foucault's Pendulum are his two most...
highbrow fiction that I haven't heard of. Wow.
What are you doing?
I know. Should I even be the host of this podcast?
What can I say?
Hey, if you could be a professor in a field, which one would you be?
Oh, that's an impossible question.
I know which one I want. I would love to be a historian.
Historian? Yeah, that would be amazing.
That's what I would want to be.
I don't know. I feel like as much as I just knocked like creative writing and arts degrees, like you could... there's an endless number of things to be extracted from having an English literature degree.
Yeah.
Just because you get to benefit from all of those ideas that everyone has ever discussed in any book.
Yeah, exactly. Oh my God, I love that.
Regardless of where they came from. Yeah, there's a whole scope of different types of writers that you could exploit, essentially, when you are in
literature makes available to you.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's funny that we actually started this conversation talking about grassroots initiatives.
Now we're
complete and utter opposite of that, right?
Wow, yeah. How did we end up here? Yeah, that's so right. But then, hey, have you thought about it like this, where maybe the job of the creative is to make those highbrow or academic concepts more accessible to the general audience? Because like there's this brilliant Chinese scholar, his name is Qian Zhongshu, and he has done a lot of fascinating research in terms of how China is represented in English literature, like from the 15th century onward, like during the very first contact. But then people around the world, and especially in China today, remember him for his fiction.
Yeah.
Because he wrote fiction about ordinary people going on ordinary lives. And then, of course, he had incorporated a lot of ideas from his study into his fiction. But then, like, so many more people read his fiction than his academic essays. So I think the one of the great things about fiction that I love is that it can be more accessible. It doesn't have to be, but it has the potential to be.
Yeah, no, I agree with what you're saying entirely. I think there's a whole other conversation to be had around what's the value in classing something highbrow or lowbrow or, literary fiction as opposed to genre fiction.
Yeah.
It's another conversation that I'd love to have someday.
Okay, should we go back to the Grassroots thing?
Yes.
I just wanted to shout out to the guy. I can't remember his name, unfortunately, but he performed at that Debaser poetry event that I went to, holding a tambourine, like, and then he was like creating his own sound effects as he was reciting poetry. That was awesome.
Yeah, Laurie, I think. Yeah,
okay.
And he's very spontaneous act. I think his friend was playing guitar.
Yeah. At the background.
Yeah, but that's what we love. That's what we love about it. It's just it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to fit convention.
No. And there's something about the tambourine that I just love. I think it's my favorite instrument.
Yeah,
I love the almost childish quality of it, and then like it's so rhythmic and so fun. And then tambourine with poetry, just two of my favorite things. Yeah, he was my favorite act of the night.
Awesome! I'm glad to hear. I'm really glad to hear. But it was funny that night that you came along. There was very few musical performances there.
Right, yeah.
Whereas the night before, we had certain people playing guitar, not necessarily playing guitar that synced up with their poetry. Like it wasn't a song; it was more so a soundscape.
Okay, yeah.
And it's fascinating watching, spoken word poetry just interact with those other mediums like soundscapes and or tambourines or things like that.
Well, LP listeners will recall our previous episode where we had the wonderful Ying, also known as the harp poet, where she incorporated spoken word with her harp.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, that was she would have the mic on her left side and then her harp on the right side.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, she's great. Okay, next I wanted to know about your experience being a journalist. So do you ever like go on the ground and interview people, or do you mostly
all the time, every day. So as I said, it's a completely different experience to writing in a not news journalism context. But I think what's been interesting to me since taking up this job is understanding how elements of my news journalism role can inform elements of my creative practice, but also understanding where to draw a line, not bringing techniques of news journalism into creative writing where they're not needed.
Really? What are some of those techniques?
Well, things like brevity, things like things like telling the most important part of the story first. Don't get me wrong, brevity is good in creative writing sometimes. A lot of the time, actually, but just not in the way that news journalism is. It encourages brevity.
Yeah, and I would imagine clickbait titles are probably a thing to leave in the realm
100%.
of journalism.
Yes, definitely. So it's been fascinating. What you come to learn is that not all writing is, just because it uses the same tools, that being, words and grammar, etc., does not mean they serve the same function at all. It's really been quite eye-opening in understanding how there can be more than one type of storytelling.
Wow. Yeah, that's definitely a great experience.
Yeah, it's fascinating because it's, I don't want to get misconstrued here, but sometimes, you know how people say, just as important as reading good books is reading bad books, right?
Okay.
And in a sense, because you know what not to do.
Yeah.
And in a sense, that's what being a news journalist has been like for my, short story writing experience or my essay writing experience.
Okay.
It's because a lot of the things that you have to do there are things that you wouldn't have to do in news journalism, or things that they actively encourage you not to do in news journalism.
Like ambiguity?
ambiguity is a huge one. Yeah, if they don't know exactly who, what, where, when, and why in the first couple of sentences, you're doing a bad job. And that's not anyone's fault. That's just the point, because that's how
and
news journalism
subtlety
works.
and stuff like that.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Yeah, that's a great point, actually.
So it's interesting, and it's made me reflect. Like, don't get me wrong, I think a lot of news journalists have made amazing authors. The one that's coming to my top of my head right now is Trent Dalton.
I knew you were going to say him. And also Louise Milligan. I haven't read her new fiction, but I want to.
I haven't read her fiction either, but yeah, amazing journalist.
Amazing investigative journalist.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I do wonder from time to time how much of their writing is informed by the journalism practice, so like the skills they acquired in writing news stories, and how much of it is just informed by the characters they encountered, or the experiences they had when they were on the road in the field. What I've taken away from it is that being a journalist isn't in and of itself going to nurture your creative writing practice.
I see.
That's something that has to happen anyway. And it reminds me of watching this Marcus Zusak interview on, probably ironically, the ABC years and years ago when Bridge of Clay came out. It was his first book in about 13 years. And Lee Sale said, what do you want to be? Not what do you want to be? What would you like to tell aspiring writers? What's your number one piece of advice? And he said, regardless of what you're doing, regardless of where you're doing it, writing just has to be number one, at lowest number two in your list of priorities. Like, family can be first, but at the end of the day, you've got to put writing above, your work or aspirations, which is a bit depressing, but it makes sense. And it's something that I've come to realize since working at the ABC, working as a news journalist, I should say, is that you do have to keep nurturing that creative side, because it's not just going to come naturally. And that's I've worked as an educator as well. I've also worked in administrative roles in the health service, where you encounter all sorts of characters and all sorts of insane things happen, which provide amazing inspiration for writing. But if you're not practicing it on the side, it's not going to happen, and you're not going to get better. Which is why you start a grassroots arts initiative
to keep yourself going.
Yeah. You get that instant feedback, instant reflection, instant community,
That's excellent insights. Thank you so much. And then I love what you said about, like, you always have to make it a priority. And then, like, it sounds like you've come to the realization that even though you are working for the ABC and then it's technically in the arts, in journalism and in writing, something about creativity itself just still doesn't really happen at work, that you have to do it on the side.
And you know what I think it is? I think it's pushing yourself, pushing boundaries, just that constant pushing and that constant need to rebuild or experiment. Whatever work you're in, whatever line of work you're in, regardless of how close it is to the practice of storytelling, there are always going to be rules, right? And I think creativity is a matter of pressing those rules.
Yeah, exactly. Right? It's freedom. And then, whatever worldly job you have, you're not going to have the same freedom as you would on a canvas or on a blank page. Yeah, thanks for sharing. That was super, super insightful.
Oh, of course. I'm glad. I hope it helps someone.
It definitely helped me. Okay, awesome. Thank you so much for the discussion, Joe. I had a brilliant time and I learned a lot.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. And thank you for listening to this episode of Licensed Poetics. I hope you found it entertaining and insightful, as I certainly have. This is the podcast Licensed Poetics, and I'm your host, Fang Ling. I'll see you in the next episode. Bye.
See ya.